Actually, yes, we do need that. Thank you very much for that. So, you know, as part of the process for finding a new home, we determined that we also wanted to have a new name, a new beginning. And we started that process back in the spring, and we've been proceeding forward for the last 6 or 8 months. We pulled a renaming committee together to do some of the heavy lifting, and I want to recognize our renaming committee here. Step forward, Courtney, John, Ruth, Tony participated, Carol, and who else? Maryland. You're one night, that's all right. So they did the heavy lifting. They considered dozens of names, dozens of iterations of the dozens of names, and then iterations of the iterations of the dozens of names. And then we held some open forums here. We had a meeting after church a couple weeks ago, and then we also asked for your input, which we collated and pulled together. And the board reviewed all of that information and also made iterations of the iterations too, I believe. How about this? How about that? Somebody already mentioned that. So, I'm going to step back with you all. So, the new name is, we need a drum roll. Everybody. 1, 2, 3. Unity in the Heart of Austin.
Material to build a home with. I don't want to end up with a heart that's homeless. Just extend your hand to me and hold this change I'm gonna be.
Wow. It's a delight to look out and see your beautiful shining faces and to know that I am here in Unity in the Heart of Austin. I had a great opportunity this last week of being in Houston with the ministers and licensed teachers from all around the south central region of Unity. And it's just an amazing and wonderful experience to get together with other licensed teachers and ministers, and there's just a great awareness and energy and transformation, healing, and great information and good insights, and it's just been a wonderful week. And so I bring you love and greetings from all of the ministers of the region. John and Bonnie got to be there with us and sharing that light and that energy. And so we're blessed to be a part of a really very good region of people who are doing magnificent and wonderful, beautiful work. And also bring you greetings from Unity of Houston. They have a wonderful, amazing community down there, and one of the largest and one of the most magnificent, I think, congregations in Unity, actually, and just they are doing some really good work. People are really experiencing transformation there, and it's just a beautiful facility, an amazing tribute to just holding a vision and really allowing Spirit to work through you and listening to guidance and things working well. And so I bring you greetings from our friends down in Houston, Texas as well. So as I was really praying about and listening to what it is that I wanted to speak on this week, and I was listening and realizing that I kept getting this idea, this message about fear. And what do we do with all this fear? There's all kinds of fear that's being presented out in the world. You know, if you turn on the news, everything is about fear. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that and what we do with that, and what I do with it, and what I've learned over the years to do with that, because it really, I think, is one of the most valuable and important things for us to learn. As spiritual beings, being on a spiritual path, one of the most valuable things lessons for us to learn is how to work with and move through the energies of fear, and the second part of that is worry, which is another form of fear. So I came across this wonderful story. There were two gas company servicemen who were, it was a senior supervisor and then a young trainee, and they were going out and they were checking the meters on people's houses, and supervisor was showing them how to do it, and they decided to park their truck down at the end of an alleyway, and they made their way down the street, down the alley, going to everyone's home and checking the meters. I'm sure you guys have seen this at different times, the meter checkers. And so at the last house on the street, there was a woman looking out the window, and she saw the two men coming into her yard and checking the meter, and didn't think too much about it. Well, in a little bit, they finished checking the meter, and the senior supervisor was kind of a playful sort of fella, and he said to the young guy, says, "I'll race you back to the truck." So they both just take off running. And they get about halfway down, and they hear behind them this woman is running right after them and just huffing and puffing, and they stop to look around, and she's just breathing hard, and she says, they say, "Well, what's going on? What are you afraid of?" And she says, "Well, when I see two gas meter guys running from my house, I figure I better run too." Oh, fear, right? Yeah. Well, there are times when fear is appropriate and times when fear is not appropriate. And I think it's valuable for us to know that. There are times when it's valuable for us to have awareness and insight. And at the same time, I think it's important for us to not hang out in it. It's important for us to recognize that we need to not necessarily hang out in the energy of fear, and we need to do those things and those practices that help us to move out of that energy. There was a man who stood on the side of the road. He was out hitchhiking one night. It was a very dark and stormy night, and in the middle of the storm. And this story came to me because I know we're coming up on Halloween, and I thought this is going to be great because we're coming up on Halloween to think about all the things that we get to be fearful about. So he's out on this dark and stormy night, and he's hitchhiking, and the night was rolling along, and there were no cars passing. He was out there, it seemed like, for the longest time, and the storm was getting stronger, and so he was really, getting concerned, and he could hardly see just even a few feet in front of him because the rain was coming down so hard. And then suddenly, from around the bend, this car comes up really slowly and stops right there. And boy, he just, automatically jumps in to get out of this storm. And as he jumps in, he's in the car, and the car starts moving, and he looks over and he notices that there's no driver. There's no driver in the car. And, he's just terrified. He thought, and the car's moving, and he's coming toward a curve, and he doesn't know what to do. And so he's praying, "Oh, God, please help me. What am I going to do here?" And he's thinking to himself, "What am I going to do?" And then as it comes to the curve, a hand reaches in through the window and grabs the wheel and turns around the curve. And he's just shocked, and he's terrified, and he doesn't know what to do. He's, "Oh my gosh, what's going on?" And he gets to another curve, and the wheel and a hand comes in again and turns it the other way. And he goes, "Oh my gosh," and finally he gets up enough nerve, and he jumps out of the car, and he starts running, and he runs into the town, and he runs into this cantina there. And he's just running in, he's just shaking like this, and he goes up, and he orders 2 shots of tequila, and he's telling everybody what's happening. He's telling, "Oh my gosh, I was in this car, and this disembodied hand came in," and everybody's just realized that, well, he's not drunk, he's just, he just got here. And so they were listening to him, and it was quiet, and then a second, 2 other guys come in and said, "Hey, there's the jerk that jumped into our car while we were pushing it." Oh my goodness. Well, I think about that, and I wonder how many times our fears really are about not really seeing the whole picture, not really knowing or understanding what's really going on. And then, of course, what brings up the fear is the fact that we don't know what's going on. And soon, it's interesting because the ego mind automatically assumes that if I don't know what's going on, it's something to be fearful about. Doesn't it? That's how our ego mind responds. Our ego mind responds with, what I don't know is to be feared. And I'm going to suggest to you that's one of the things for all of us to begin to recognize within ourselves, is to recognize when we jump into that way of thinking or that way of understanding, that if I don't see or know or understand what's happening or what might happen or what's going to happen, then it's something to be feared. I loved Frankie's song this morning of learning to be okay with not knowing. Because one of the most valuable things we can do is begin to move into that awareness that even though we don't know, there's something at work that is of a greater good. This is called faith. In many ways, we need to understand that faith and fear have the same energy. And faith and fear is really dependent upon what we focus this faculty in. We can focus our faculty of faith in those things that we imagine may happen, or we can focus our faith in the present moment and knowing that in that present moment, and in that present moment is the presence of the divine. And not only is the presence of the divine here in this present moment, but the presence of the divine is in the next moment, and the next moment, and the next moment. And 50 moments out, we're still in the presence. And knowing that that presence is always available is one of the most valuable things we can learn in our lives. It's a practice, though, isn't it? I mean, it's a practice, and it's one of the ways that we train to learn to experience more of our unique nature, of our divine nature in life. I was reminded of the story, and I know many of you have heard about this and read about it at different times, but remember the War of the Worlds experience back many years ago? There was an episode in the American radio drama anthology series. It was the Mercury Theater on the Air, and it was performed as a Halloween episode, and it was War of the Worlds. And it was based upon the book, The War of the Worlds, by H.G. Wells. It was hosted by Orson Welles, the great actor Orson Welles, and he presented this program, and the first 2/3 of the program was presented as though it were live radio broadcast. And it actually created significant panic throughout the area, significant panic, because people honestly believed that they were being invaded by aliens, that the earth was being invaded by aliens. And there were people who were having all kinds of amazing, fearful reactions to this idea that we were being invaded by aliens. They had no clue, they had no idea when they did this that it would cause such panic. And so in the days following the adaptation, however, there was widespread outrage over the panic by certain listeners who believed that the events described in the program were real. Sound familiar? I love one of the sayings that I love, an acronym that I came across some years ago. I know many of you have heard this, that the word fear, F-E-A-R, stands for false expectations appearing real. Let me read that one again. False expectations appearing real. So what are some things that are going on that you have noticed that you tend to have these expectations about? And not necessarily positive ones. Perhaps there is a fear in your life about lack or limitation. Perhaps there is a fear in your life about dis-ease. Perhaps there's a fear in your life about the loss of a relationship or love. And when we really begin to understand from a spiritual perspective that the reality is, the truth is, when we really get back to truth with a capital T, that none of these ultimately are possible. None of them are actually ultimately possible, because there really is truly only one presence and one power in the universe, in our lives, in this place, in this moment, in this experience. And when we can remind ourselves that, then we attune ourselves more to that understanding and that knowing. Things seem different. Not only do they seem different, things become different. We begin to experience more of this understanding, of this assurance, this opportunity to experience the presence and the peace that is always available to us. So as I was reflecting on and praying about and listening to this idea about this, and I was looking through Scripture, and it came to me that, Jesus really had basically 2 commandments. Do you realize that? He basically had 2 commandments. And check me on this. Go and read some of the things that, not only Jesus, but all throughout the Bible. You'll see 2 primary things being said and 2 primary things being taught. One is love. Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. And I'm going to suggest to you that's one commandment. It's all the same. As you love your neighbor, you're loving God. As you love God, you cannot love God and hate your neighbor. You can't love God and hate yourself. It's all the same. It's love. And the second commandment that he gave, that a lot of people maybe don't notice as much, it's in there. It's in almost every other thing that he says, it seems like. The second one is, fear not. Fear not. Let me read to you a couple of things. Matthew chapter 10. Fear them not, therefore, for there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, and hid that shall not be known. What I tell you in darkness, speak that in the light. And what you hear in the ear, preach that upon the housetops. And don't fear those which can kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but fear kills the body and the soul. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing? And one of them shall not fall to the ground without your Father knowing of it. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore, for ye are so much more of value than even many sparrows. Fear not. In Luke it says, while Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. Your daughter is dead. And they said, do not bother the teacher anymore. And hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, don't be afraid. Just believe, and she will be healed. Don't be afraid. In Luke 12:32, fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. And in Timothy, Paul says, for God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. In Hebrews, so that they may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do unto me. And one of my favorites in John, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. Because fear hath torment, he that fears is not in perfect love. And I would say the opposite of course is true, and that's what they're saying here. When you're in love, you can't be in fear. You can't be. They don't coexist. I came across this interesting, anybody ever felt insecure or felt inferior in time in some way? Everybody ever had that kind of, this is one of my favorites. Inferiority complex. It's a conviction by a jury of your fears. We've got this little, this committee in our head, right? It's a jury. And it's all about focusing on our fears of not good enough, can't do this. So there's all different ways that we express and experience fear, and we live in that space a lot of times. But it's important for us as spiritual beings to really align ourselves back with an essence and a knowing of our true nature. Our true nature really is the presence of God. And the presence of God is love. God is love, and they that abide in love abide in God. And so when we find ourselves looking out at the news, looking out at all the fear-mongering and doomsday, and you guys know what I'm talking about. It's out there. You can see it. It's not that we ignore it. It's not that we say that there's not something going on. But it's really valuable and important for us to notice our energy about what it is, to notice our energy about life, to notice our energy and know that we are created as creative beings. We are created in the image and after the likeness of the divine, which is the creative process itself. And so we are right now in the process of creating, and we are in the process of creating when we're watching the news. We're in the process of creating when we're reading the newspaper. We're in the process of creating at all times. And so our work is to notice and pay attention to the energy and the consciousness that's going on within us when we are watching the news or when we're watching. It is not only in the news, of course. I mean, the media today, and I was sharing this with a group last night, I think it came to me this week as I was preparing that back in the, I guess probably more in the 70s, you would hear this saying in the media and in advertising and such, that sex sells. How many did not hear that? You certainly heard that. And I'm going to suggest to you there's something to that. That's why they latched on to so much of this. But probably 15, 20 years ago, maybe not that long ago, one of the things that I am quite convinced that the media discovered, that even more than sex sells, fear sells. It is so valuable and important for us to understand that this is actually going on. And that's a lot of energy that's going into much of the media today. And so it's important for us to not allow ourselves to be connected to and caught up in and get our energies all wound up in this kind of use of fear. The purpose of the fear is not to inform as much as it is to get us to have a reaction, to get us to have a fearful reaction, and then to take actions that are being manipulated by this fear. I think it's important for us to be informed of what's happening in life, informed what's happening in the world, but in order to do that, it's so important for us to do that from a place of inner awareness of the truth of our nature. Paul said, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our hearts and minds. And the renewing of our hearts and minds is reminding ourselves to go back to that awareness, that understanding, that experience of knowing that we are one with the presence of God. That God is present in that moment, in that time, in that experience. And begin to hold the energy of this and really see and experience life from the perspective of being a spiritual being, creating more love in the world. Many of you know that I have been a Course in Miracles student for many years, and there are many things that I love about the Course in Miracles, and there are things that I find that are challenging, but I really find that there's many great truths in the Course in Miracles. And one of them that really speaks to me and has spoken to me over the years is this understanding about love and fear. The Course in Miracles says the opposite of love is fear. But what is all-encompassing can have no opposite. If we understand that the divine is love, it can have no opposite. There really is only love. And the more we can remind ourselves of this and tune into that knowing, we experience life more from that perception and that perspective. It goes on to say, perfect love casts out fear, quoting Scripture. If fear exists, then there is not perfect love, but only perfect love exists. If there is fear, it produces a state that does not exist. Remember our story earlier? When we look out and see and experience the world through the eyes of fear, we're not seeing the whole story. There was a great example that was given at our conference, and actually Cindy Wigglesworth is a great, one of our presenters there, and she showed this wonderful picture, and had a picture up on the screen. I'm going to give you a visual here. Picture on the screen, and on there was a tree branch, and there was a couple of beautiful cardinals on the tree branch, and you look in the background, there's this beautiful, peaceful meadow looking, and after that there's this wonderful house. Just a very nice, quiet, peaceful meadow. And she said, you know, this is how we are seeing life. And then she expanded a little further, and she says, but oftentimes we're not getting all the information. Sometimes we need more information. She expanded the window, and actually the house was on fire. Now, it doesn't mean that we necessarily need to be fearful unless we see and know and have the information. But we oftentimes view the world with limited information. So when we're in a place where there is something to be fearful of, there's a purpose for fear. There's a place for it. But most of the time, we are creating fear where there is nothing to be fearful of. You understand what we're talking about here? The difference between fear, you might say, and fright. Fright is there's an immediate experience that's going on right here and now, an immediate challenge to us in some way that we need to perhaps take action on. And then when that's over with, we no longer need to hold on to that energy. But what we tend to do is we tend to hold on to that energy, and we go into the bar and we're telling everybody in the bar about it, right? That's getting back to my story. I'm not saying you're all going to the bar. I'm getting back to the story of the guy in the car. We spend so much time and energy continuing to talk about the experience, continuing to put our energy into it, continuing to live in that energy. And we're no longer living in the present and no longer living in the presence. We're limiting our awareness of being in the presence. Let's put it that way. Because the truth of the matter is we never are out of the presence of God. But we can limit our understanding and our experience and our awareness of that presence. It has already been said that you believe you cannot control fear because you yourself made it. And your belief in it seems to render it out of your control. Yet any attempt to resolve the error through attempting to master the mastery of fear is useless. In fact, it asserts the power of fear by the very assumption that it needs to be mastered. The true resolution rests entirely on mastery through love. In other words, you ever had a fear and tried to not have it? How well does that work for you? Yeah. We tend to try to push down our fears, don't we? We tend to hide from them. We tend to try and push them away. We tend to not experience them. And what we're being taught here is that the way out of fear is to move back into an energy that is not feeding the fear. Does that make sense? To shift back into an awareness of the presence, to shift back into an awareness of the present moment, to move back into the now. I had an experience some years ago. Actually, it was right after I graduated from ministerial school. And I was actually going to try out at a church down in Mississippi, as a matter of fact, at that time. And, you know, went through the tryout and got pretty clear afterwards that that wasn't my place anymore. Actually, interestingly enough, it was the first Unity church that I'd ever been to. And I got a call to come back and to possibly minister there. And after praying about it and listening to it, I knew that that wasn't my place. But flying back from that experience, I went through, I was flying on the airplane, and they were having tornadoes all over the South at that time. I mean, all over, everywhere. We were actually redirected to 3 different airports on that trip to avoid, and they were having tornadoes up in the Kansas City area. I was flying from Mississippi back up to Kansas City. And while I was on the plane, the turbulence got pretty intense. In fact, there was one time where I understand that we dropped about 100 feet out of the sky. And there was a lot of fear on the plane, I can assure you. And I was afraid. And like any good, Unity student, I started saying the prayer of protection. I love the prayer of protection. It is actually one of the most valuable gifts that I've experienced and received in Unity. And so, like any good Unity student, I was saying the prayer of protection. The light of God surrounds me, the love of God enfolds me, the power of God protects me, the power of the presence of God watches over me. Know what I'm talking about? Yeah. And I was actually saying it over and over again, pretty much that way. And then I stopped. And I started saying it and listening to what I was saying. The light of God surrounds me. Not only was I listening to it, I decided I was really going to take that in. The light of God surrounds me. Can you just take a moment and take that in? The love of God enfolds me. The power of God protects me. The presence of God watches over me wherever I am. God is. And where God is, all is well. And I can tell you, in that moment, the turbulence was continuing. We were going up and down, and I moved into a place of absolute peace in knowing that even if the plane went down, even if I died, I was safe. It was an amazing, powerful, mystical experience. Turbulence going on everywhere, lightning hitting the airplane, the plane rocking and flipping and going this way, not flipping, but it was all over the place. And I felt myself being thrown up in the air, and what a metaphor for so many things that go on in our lives if you think about it. And in the middle of that, I found that I was able to stop and recognize and know that all is well. When I think about it even now, I can feel myself kind of choking up a little bit because it was a very profound experience for me. And I want you to understand and know that it doesn't matter if the plane seems to be going down. If you will take the time to move back into that space, there is a presence and an awareness and a light and a peace that can come to you even in those times, even in those moments. Dr. David Hawkins, another one of my favorite teachers, he talks about in serious spiritual work, it is necessary to have a simple, basic tools which are absolutely dependable and safe to rely on in order to walk through fear and uncertainty. One basic truth that is of inestimable value, easy for me to say, right? Inestimable value and usefulness is the dictum that all fear is fallacious and not based on truth, with a capital T. Fear is overcome by walking directly through it until one breaks through into the joy that the fear is blocking. The joy that follows facing any spiritual fear comes from the discovery that it was merely an illusion without basis or reality. One of my friends was a member of my congregation up in the Northwest, and is also a member of another wonderful spiritual group. She sends these wonderful posts at different times, and as I was preparing this one, this one came to me this morning, as a matter of fact. It says, "Dwell in his light and become so full of it that darkness of the world will recede, for your outshining of his radiance reveals it." I love that. So when you find yourself in those times, those circumstances, even if it's not the panicky kind of fear that you might experience with a plane going crazy, but it's just insecurity or fear of, well, you guys know your fears, right? You know what they are. If you're honest with yourself, you'll look at them and you'll say, oh, that's a fear. I've got it. But the question is, am I going to let it have me? Right? So I want to close with another story that I came across that I thought was really very valuable and apropos. This was happened during World War II, and apparently there was this U.S. Marine who got separated from his unit on the Pacific Islands, and the fighting had been really intense, and smoke and crossfire, he had lost touch with his comrades, and so he was alone in the jungle. And he could hear the enemy soldiers coming in his direction, and so he began looking and scrambling for cover, and as he climbed up, he found a cave up on a ridge, and so he found a small cave, and he went and crawled inside this small cave. And he could still hear the enemy was coming toward him. And so he was afraid, he was frightened, and he began to pray. And as he began to focus his ideas and his thoughts on prayer and asking for help and asking for protection, and after a while he just quietly laid there, listening to the enemy beginning to draw closer. And, you know, he kind of thought, well, I guess God's not going to help me. I guess I'm not going to make it out of this one. But then he noticed a spider. And he noticed that the spider began weaving a web across the front of the cave. And as he observed, he could still hear the enemy coming closer. And the spider kept working, and before long he developed a whole spider web across the front of the cave. Well, he thought to himself, well, what I really need is a brick wall here, Lord. But as the enemy came closer, began inspecting all of the different caves, one enemy came and looked at the cave and then immediately went away. And the enemy left and left him in the cave. And he realized afterward that the spider had weaved the web across the entrance to the cave, and the enemy assumed that because there was a spider web there, that it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. And he was protected. You know, sometimes we think that it has to be something great or miraculous or fantastic or a brick wall to be able to save us or be able to protect us. And sometimes it just can be the most natural of things and the most simple of things, like a spider web. If we're open to it, if we allow ourselves to tune into that knowing, that presence, there's something that does work in our lives that will bring about a greater good in some way that we perhaps never even imagined possible. It doesn't have to be in brick walls or flashing lights. Sometimes it's just in the simplest things. And so when you find yourself experiencing and looking at and thinking about all of what the world is trying to present to you and trying to help you to get hooked into the fears in life, I really encourage you to come back to this very simple tool, a very simple tool, a very powerful tool, a very powerful understanding and awareness. Wherever God is. And there's no place where God is not. And all is well. Let's move into our meditation time. So let's move into that stillness, into that place of quiet, of peace. I invite you to move in to that place within yourself of stillness, where we are most open and receptive to knowing and feeling and experiencing the one presence and one power. And in this place of stillness, I invite you to reflect on and listen and feel and know these words. The light of God surrounds me. Imagine and visualize and see that light as understanding, awareness, wisdom. And it's a light that is uplifting and healing. And it's not only surrounding, but know and feel that it is in the very essence of your being. The love of God enfolds me. God is love, and in that love we safely dwell. The power that is God, that is everywhere present, that is the only power, is our safety, our protection, is my safety and my protection. The presence of God watches over and in and through me. And I am present to that presence here and now. I release the past. I release any fears of the future into that knowing that the presence is always present. Wherever I am, the divine is there. And wherever God is, the divine is. There is absolute well-being. Let yourself feel that feeling, that energy of well-being. Practice being in that feeling of the heart of well-being. And know that all is well. All is truly well. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Blessed Spirit, for that assurance, for that knowing, and for my part in sharing that light in the world. And so it is. Amen. Bring back your awareness into this room, this time, this place. Staying in that understanding, that knowing, with the open heart of awareness of the presence. Take another nice deep breath and gently open your eyes. And so it is.